Sounds good. All right. Welcome to everybody. This is the Privacy Exchange Community Show and Tell series today with our very special guest, Steve Lappenbusch. In our session today with Steve, we're going to get a rare glimpse into data brokering from the inside. So we'll be discussing different types of data brokers and how they operate. Steve leads privacy and compliance teams at a data broker, and he's worked in the industry for about 20 years. Prior to his role there, starting a privacy team from scratch, he's worked in academia doing research on user experience, sales, product, and has, I guess in the last, 20 years, you've made over $100 million for your companies. I think you said something like that. We'll have to dig into that a little bit more, Steve. But as always, we'll spend the next 25 minutes or so in the following way. Steve and I will have a chat for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. The first session, as you can tell, is recorded, and during the audience Q&A, we will turn off the recording, so feel free to ask any questions you want to during that time without being recorded. So as a reminder, all of the information we share in today's webinar is for educational purposes only. It is not legal advice. We are not lawyers. We're not your lawyer. If you need legal advice, please reach out to your own lawyer. Additionally, Steve is joining us today in his personal capacity. He is not representing his employer. So did want to just get that out of the way. All right, Steve, are you ready to hop in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So my first question, I'd like to know more about your background because it's very fascinating, especially because you've worked in data brokering for a long time and have seen the industry change over the years. So I'd like to know how your career evolved and what it is that you do today.
Yeah, so I got to where I am through a not necessarily very straight line. So my career in tech started, about 20 years ago. I had a career before that. It started in user experience, as you say, and I did some work in humanitarian relief on how people used technology in high-risk environments, and that led to a short stint doing UX at Microsoft, and then I transitioned to a job at a larger data broker, and I just started talking to customers about how they use data, and it became very clear to me that the biggest thing that's going to happen over the next several decades is how people are constructed out of data. That entire universe is going to be so important to everything in the economy. And so I just went from role to role in that capacity. And when I joined the startup that I'm at now, they needed someone to launch a privacy and compliance unit. And I raised my hand because I built products out of data in all sorts of regulated environments. I built products with data that you can't build products out of anymore. And I said, hey, let's build a different kind of privacy and compliance unit that takes the privacy rules as design constraints and tries to navigate to growth within the civil constraints that society has put upon us. And let's use that as our North Star. And so that's how I ended up where I am.
Well, that's so fascinating. We always find people have way different paths to privacy. So it's interesting that you started from product and then saw privacy as a private design constraint, how to work with those constraints. Well, so I'm sure you've realized over the time that you've been in this role that privacy-related laws and bills have swiftly evolved in the recent years. So I'm curious how that's impacted your work and how you approach it. It sounds like you looked at it previously from like a product and like the spirit of privacy to now having to deal in a regulated environment. So if you could share a little bit more about that, I'd like to know more.
Yeah, so I mean, right now I'm tracking about a little over 200 bills that are relevant to the business that I'm in, and everything from law enforcement opt-out to data broker registration to privacy, children's data, social media, what have you. And the trends that I'm seeing are pretty clear, which is that the constraints will continue. The constraints will actually get a little more predictable. Everyone talks about the patchwork, but the truth is at this point, the lines and trends are pretty clear. And the way it really impacts the way that just about any data broker will look at the market is just in terms of, what's it going to cost us to go there and build a product out of those kinds of data. And that's how civil society is supposed to work. That's the point of the constraints is to either make it so hard that you can't build a product out of that, and it's so costly that you just don't, or you find some differentiation and a way to build a product in a compliant fashion in a market that your competitors just can't. And that's the point of the constraints, right? I mean, I think of privacy as a product. I'm building a product with internal users, with external users, and with super users, which is what I call the regulators and the enforcement agencies. I think of them as super users of my product. And all of these bills are just society's expression of saying, look, you can go over there, but you can't go over there. And if you go over there, you have to do it a particular way. Businesses have had those constraints on them forever. Now, I will say the other thing I'm seeing is that while right now, sort of the third party data brokers, what people think of as data brokers, have been the traditional recipients of most of those constraints. I see a much more broad application of those constraints across all sorts of tech businesses and really all businesses, but especially tech, than even 2 or 3 years ago.
Interesting. Well, so kind of related to that, you said you have like internal users, super users, like regulators, but then external users. What sort of advice, practical advice, would you give to people like in this room about how they should work with data brokers, especially now that these regulatory and legal environments are shifting? How do they approach working with you in the best possible way? Like, what kind of questions should they ask? What should they be aware of? Are there differences with companies like the one you work at versus, other types of data brokers? What should they be aware of?
I would say there's a couple of different dimensions that you want to look at and ask questions about very specifically. And the first is just your basic due diligence questions. We'll ask about anything. Is it a real business? Is it registered as a business where it says it does, where it says it is? Are the people who run it or own it, are they on any of the sanctions or debarment lists? Those sorts of things. And then after that, from a specific data broker perspective, what you really want to ask are about what I call the privacy supply chain, which is, have you collected the data, or do you have supplier partnership agreements that enforce all of the rules all the way back to the point where the data was collected? You really got to get them to be able to document that privacy supply chain. And if they can't, then you should ask some harder follow-up questions, because any decent data broker will be able to do that for you. And if they can't, then frankly, in my opinion, I wouldn't do business with them. And because all of those things are documentable. They really are. It's just basically, it's as simple as show me the MSA that you have with your suppliers that says that you are, at least as restrictive, et cetera, and so forth. Everybody should be able to provide that to customers if they're licensing data to them. It's not a big mystery. It's like any other due diligence activity. It just happens to do with data.
Okay, that's fascinating. I'm going to just kind of ask a follow-up question related to that. I've recently read in the news that there are a number of very large, what I would consider professional data brokers that have failed to do basic things like register themselves in the state of California. Is that part of a due diligence
Yeah.
check that you'd recommend for
It's
buying?
one that I do on any supplier that we have in our vendor universe. First thing I do after I look at the basic ham and egg stuff you look at for any business is I go to the 4 states that register data brokers, and if they're not registered in all 4, the answer is no. I mean,
Yeah.
it's super easy sort of sorting hat exercise. It's like, look, if they haven't registered in all 4 states, assuming they have data on people in all 4 states, which
Yeah.
is pretty good bet,
Yeah.
then what it is it's kind of an indication that they're just not taking it seriously. And if they're not taking that seriously, what else are they not taking seriously? You
Yeah.
don't know, but that's a pretty good temperature check.
That's a very good point. Is there sort of like an industry body checklist out there, like with these kinds of things, or can I pick your brain after this show to get some other like high level things, like check the data broker registries, get an MSA of the data? What did you call it? The privacy consent chain, or what did you call that?
I call it the privacy supply chain.
The privacy supply chain. Okay, and so that's documenting that the suppliers are following the rules. They've contractually done that. Uh, Fascinating. I'm glad to hear that. That's changed something in my mind about regulating data brokers. And so the ones that are following the rules obviously are the ones you want to do business with.
Yeah.
Kind of related to that, you've talked about the data brokers that are, making sure they're following all these new rules, but now there's this like new kind of player in the realm, which is like software companies themselves, like SaaS companies. seem to be selling data more often and may not be considered like a traditional data broker. How are you thinking about that? Is there anything that you give our folks listening, any tips on how to deal with that?
I, you know, that's going to be an area where there's going to be a lot of growing edges and a lot of a learning curve for folks, especially in the SaaS industry, where states like California are essentially pushing out the boundary of what counts as a data broker. So even if you have a first party relationship, if you also have third party data or even second party data that you made, right? So metadata you made about the data you got from somebody, and you're somehow monitoring that, selling, sharing. By the way, I actually really like California's definition of sale. I think that represents the reality of the data industry. If you're pushing data around and you're getting something back, let's just stop with the sophistry. You're selling data. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's just say what it is. And I think keeping it simple like that allows everybody to go, okay, look, if we're moving data around and it's not for the purpose that it's not for the actual provision of the service the consumer gave the data for, then we should probably just all be following the same rules, right? I mean, the analogy that I use that I've heard someone else use is, the government has rules on how all milk is pasteurized. What they don't do is they don't say, well, for this kind of a cow, you have to pasteurize the data, but for this kind of a cow, you don't. I don't know. When I open up the carton of milk, assuming there's any left, I have a teenage boy, so we don't get a lot of milk left. But if there's any milk left in there, I don't know how many different cows it came from, and I don't care. I just want to be safe. And so I think of this in terms of California's expanding the definition. I think it was Maryland that's got a bill pending right now that would really open up the definition in a way that I think would shock a lot of people if they passed that, because it would essentially be every tech company that's got data about people if they're monetizing it. I mean, it would really blow open the definition of data brokers such that it's basically just tech company. And I think that's coming in one way or another. That's coming. So California's just taking the first step. You've got to take a look at your operations and say, are we doing serious data provenance? Are we offering people the ability to exercise all of the rights as easily as possible, not just as account holders, but as members of the public? Because there's a substantial operational difference in opening yourself up to the public versus opening up to just people that you have an account with. And all of these changes are coming, and I'm not so sure that everybody in tech businesses are ready.
Oh, that is fascinating. And you said that's happening in Maryland, that bill that would expand
I,
the definition of a
I
data
think
broker?
it's Maryland. I'd have to go back. It's either Maryland or Minnesota. I get
Okay, M state of the
yeah.
200 bills you're tracking.
Which is another thing I highly recommend anybody in a privacy or compliance capacity do is if you don't have someone on your team who's got some software to track stuff, you really do. It saves me, I don't know how many hours a week of sort of, piecing together bits and pieces from, different newsletters or different Google alerts. Just buy yourself a piece of software for a few $1,000s a year and you can monitor the whole thing.
I think I know what software you're talking about. And yes, it can get very confusing if you don't have a way to organize that. I do have one final question for you, Steve, before we open it up to the audience. And that is, given your experience working 20 years in this industry, I'm sure there's a lot that you see that maybe other people don't think about. So what would you want folks to know about data brokers that they probably don't?
That's a great question. I think I would sort of zoom out and I would sort of invite people to think about data in the economy as a whole. And because in my brain, I think of data brokers as sort of operating on two different axes, right? Sort of an XY thing. And the first is, from completely non-sensitive data to very sensitive data, right? So at the top, you've got like your genetic data, and at the bottom, you've got like your work email address or something, right? And then on the other axis, it's from first party to third party. And that first party to third party is one where people don't think of it as a first party data broker. That's just not a phrase that makes sense to a lot of people. But if you ever read, for example, in detail, your agreement with your streaming services, yeah, the phrase affiliates, subsidiaries, and partners is probably embedded in there. And what that means is your data is going all over. And so first party data brokers are a real thing. And I think if we're serious about privacy, we need to get everybody on board with the same set of rules, because I'm a big fan of people exercising their rights. I'm a big fan of making sure businesses design value according to the constraints. But most of the data that moves around in the world, as I have seen it, is not from your traditional third-party registered data brokers. It's from these first-party data brokers, as I call them. And so that's something I think that people in the privacy world have a role in sort of giving voice to and asking, well, why is that data being monetized? And we've got rules there, but not that. It's sort of the, shouldn't we pasteurize milk from all of the cows in the same way kind of a thing.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.